In reviewing Captive Audience, Time magazine calls it the most important volume to be released in the last few years that describes the sad, some might say embarrassing state of the U.S. telecommunications market. Time magazine also goes on to say that the book is a vivid and eye-opening description of what ails America's cable and telecom market, and for that reason it should be required reading for everyone interested in tech policy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Susan Crawford.
Well, it's wonderful to be here and to see so many old friends and some new students. We just started class yesterday, so thanks for coming. And to be back at Cardozo, which has always been so welcoming to me. I'm just too happy for words. I'm just delighted. And it's a great pleasure to introduce you to this book, Captive Audience. All credit for the title goes to Ron Suskind, who has come up with lots of other titles, and we brainstormed about this, and he said this would be good. You're a imaginative bunch, I know you well, so let's cast our minds back to the mid-30s. In the 30s, electricity was considered to be a luxury, something really only for the rich. 90% of farmers did not have electricity when FDR came into office. And Robert Caro has written about this very movingly in his books, that the people in the hill country outside Austin, they said, we loved FDR here. We read all about his fireside chats, his wonderful fireside chats, but we couldn't hear them. They couldn't hear them because they didn't have electricity, because a series of very large private companies had controlled the generation and transmission of electricity in this country. They were gouging the rich, leaving out the poor, covering only those areas where they felt it was economical to do so, raising rates steadily. And it was a tragedy for the country. Roosevelt took this on. He said, I have to face these special interests. He actually accused them of deception. They were making up stories about the state of competition for electricity in America. He understood how central it was. And with great leadership and strength, he marched ahead and ensured that we take this for granted today. We think of electricity as just a utility, something available to all Americans at a reasonable price. Well, now cast your mind forward. Tonight at 6 o'clock, it's getting cold in some place in western Massachusetts, let's imagine. And your kid has not yet finished his homework, and in 2 hours, the local library is going to be closed, but you've got to have dinner. After dinner, you're going to drive to that library parking spot because you don't have internet access at home. But it's available from the public Wi-Fi in the library. And so to get access to it, just to allow your child to be able to do his homework, you'll drive to that parking lot and sit there. Many people do this night after night in very civilized areas like western Massachusetts. The problem in the country today is that fully a quarter of Americans don't have access to wired internet access, even if they could pay for it. They would pay anything for it, but it's not available where they are. Many other Americans find it to be too expensive. And so as a result, fully a third of Americans don't subscribe to high-speed wired internet access, even though it's essential. If you're going to be applying for a job or getting a great education, it's part of the suite of commodities that you need in order to survive. So if you're going to start a business, in particular, access to healthcare initiatives, there's a lot of news these days about elder care that could be possible using the monitoring capabilities of high-speed internet access. Certainly applying for a job, almost impossible to do today if you don't have a wired connection at home. I got a call today from a guy living right outside Kansas City. He's 4 miles outside Kansas City, he told me. There's no wired internet connection there. And he cannot apply for a job using just his 3G mobile connection. Can't fill out the form. The keyboard's really clumsy. The interface to the site doesn't work very well. He feels completely left in the dark. This isn't just a problem of a digital divide affecting the poor and people in rural areas. Also, rich people, people in New York, are being charged through the nose for high-speed internet access. 2 weeks ago, I took a vacation in Seoul, which I recognize is a weird place to go on vacation, but I wanted to see what it was like, and I'd heard that it's the most connected country in the world. When you move into an apartment in Seoul, you have a choice of 3 fiber internet connections, competitive connections, each for about $30 a month. And because it's such a competitive situation, they'll come to your apartment and, fix you up within a day. They have to, because otherwise you'd leave and go somewhere else. In America, we don't really have that choice. Although other utilities are heavily overseen, there's a cop on the beat for gas, electricity, and certainly for water. We make sure that all Americans have access to clean water and a good flow of electricity. And for gas, we don't do that for communications. We treat them as purely private entities. They sort of feel like they have a public face, but there's very, very little oversight right now in America. How did we get here? Well, there was a point not too long ago when every American had a phone, and they were all available for a reasonable price. And it was a universal obligation, sort of a social justice moment for the country. Even though it was expensive and difficult, we made sure that everybody had a phone. Beginning in 1996, with the passage of the Telecommunications Act, then, we figured that competition was going to protect Americans and bring us all connections to the internet. That the old phone connections we had by dial-up over copper lines would compete with cable connections that had been rolled out in the 60s and 70s, which would in turn compete with wireless connections made available over the airwaves. This assumption, on the basis of which we deregulated this entire sector, removed all the rules, turns out not to be true. In fact, where consolidation is possible, competition is impossible. And particularly on the wired side of things, consolidation has been enormous. What we've ended up with in America is control of wired internet access by a series of local cable monopolies. In something they called the Summer of Love, Time Warner and Comcast and Cablevision and others divided up the country among themselves. So Comcast gets Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, and Time Warner got Dallas and Cleveland and a few other places. They clustered their systems. This makes a lot of sense for a profit maximizing area. At the same time, the phone companies discovered that it costs much more to dig up that old copper wire and replace it with fiber, which is the world-class, almost infinitely upgradable, future-proof method of information delivery. It's very expensive to dig up a copper wire and replace it with fiber. On the other hand, it's pretty cheap to upgrade cable system electronics to make them capable of carrying internet transmissions. Seeing this, the phone companies, who are rational and governed by their Wall Street needs, needing to keep their stock price up, backed away from installing fiber, leaving the cable companies alone in providing internet access to most Americans over a wire. So that's the wired side. On the wireless side, AT&T and Verizon collectively control about 70% of the marketplace for wireless subscriptions. It's a separate market, not substitutable for a wire because of the laws of physics, which I'd love to teach you all about. And also because of just the inherent capacity limitations of this particular medium. Right? So, and Verizon and AT&T have huge advantages in spectrum holdings, the frequencies they have licenses to, and the buildings they've already created for their towers, for their marketplaces. So they're getting about 80% of the free cash flow. Cable, for their part, is getting the lion's share of new internet subscriptions. So here's a chart based on FCC data from March 2010. And it shows a sort of time series moving from left to right. 5 years ago, we did have a number of choices for high-speed wired internet access. So if you read down the chart, it shows that for speeds about 1 megabits per second download, you could choose cable or DSL. They were roughly equivalent, they cost about the same, and that's where we started off this story. As we get into higher speeds, you'll see that DSL, that's the high-speed internet access that's available over your copper phone line, falls away. Because as a matter of physics, it just can't provide the information carrying capacity of a cable. So for about half the country, 51, 57%, your only choice for this 10 megabits per second connection is cable. Then when we get to the speeds that we're going to need to compete with the rest of the world, everything falls away except for cable, these local cable monopolies, and fiber to the home. Fiber to the home is even better than cable. It is a symmetrical connection, again, infinitely upgradable, and capable of providing equal upload speeds to download. Verizon is selling fiber, but remember, they've backed off. They're selling it to only about 14% of Americans. So in Comcast territory, it competes with Verizon in only 15% of that space. So in most of Comcast area, it operates alone. Time Warner faces competition from Verizon in only about 11% of its territory. It operates alone. And so that means for the speeds that we're going to need, more than 80% of Americans will have just one choice, and it's their local cable monopoly. Fiber to the home to all Americans would be great. That's what a number of other countries are doing. Australia, Sweden, Japan, South Korea, sort of endless numbers of countries that are taking care of us, but not us. We're just leaving it all to the cable companies. So it is great to be Comcast. Here's average revenue for their video data customers. Manhattan is Time Warner territory. So every time I say Comcast, just think Time Warner. It's the same kind of story. Their average revenue is really skyrocketing. They're able to add all kinds of services onto your bundle. Notice you've suddenly started renting a cable modem. And what else are you doing? You're paying more for programming. They can do that because they can do it. They're able to pass down their programming costs, which are very steep, to their customers. And everybody wants this bundle. If you care about sports, the only way you're going to get it is through your cable connection. So even though the costs of every other part of the internet ecosystem are going way down, so storage is cheaper, computation is cheaper, connectivity is getting more and more expensive, and Comcast's average revenue is going up. They're reaping. They've made their investments, now they can just reap. So it's very good to be Comcast or Time Warner. 94% plus of new broadband subscriptions are going to the cable companies because people want these speeds. They're dying for it. No one has ever said, I wish my internet connection was slower. If only it was slower. We just don't do that. That's not the way our country is. So that we're fleeing DSL, the copper lines, and adopting cable like there's no tomorrow. And their dominance is growing. Here's a picture of somebody. Does anybody know who this is? Who is this? Stephen Levy knows who this is because he writes about this area. But I bet the rest of you don't know who this is. Okay, you better get to know this guy. This is Brian Roberts. He is the CEO of Comcast, and he is a very skilled, calm gentleman. And this is a family company. It's a great American company. There are lots of stories about it in the book. Here's a quote from him, what he said to his investors in 2011. He's talking about broadband. He's saying that cable is essentially a broadband play now. That's their main business. They're making 95% profits, 95% profits on their broadband product. So he says, in our footprint, we've got about 30% market share, he says, as of about 2011. We're looking for maybe 90, maybe 100, you know. And we have one competitor, and the competitor he's talking about is Verizon's Fios. In 2010, Verizon backed off, said it wasn't going to invest any further in fiber, leaving places, perfectly reasonable places like Baltimore and Alexandria and Boston without coverage. And then at the end of 2011, both Verizon and Comcast joined together in a deal. They're cooperating now, showing that they're not exactly competing fiercely. Verizon takes wireless, cable takes wired, and they're going to co-market each other's services. But look what he says. In the next 10 years, people will want more bits in their house, whether that's Xbox, Skype, or Netflix. I like that position. Yeah, I would like that position too. It's fantastic. You're right there in everybody's house, able to charge the same number of people more and more money. There's nothing evil about this. It's just that profit maximization may not necessarily be aligned with the interests of the country in making sure that everybody gets a fast, wired, high-speed internet access connection. So that's the wired story. On the wireless side, as I sketched out for you, it's really AT&T and Verizon. SoftBank is now making an investment in Sprint, which may change the picture a bit, but probably not too much, because Verizon and AT&T have such a head start in terms of their spectrum holdings and their existing subscribers. They're able now to do about the same thing that cable is doing, which is to keep charging the same number of people more money. You may have thought of Verizon and AT&T as phone companies with wires. They're shifting their character to mostly wireless. So 2/3 of Verizon's revenue is now coming from its wireless side. And similarly, you're seeing AT&T becoming more and more of a wireless company. Verizon's doing even better because they've sold off a bunch of their telephone lines in places like Vermont, New Hampshire, and West Virginia. So they've really transformed their character into purely wireless companies. Here's a really dramatic picture. This shows the difference between Europe and America. So America, average revenue per customer climbing for Verizon and AT&T. In Europe, going down. Pretty simple chart. This happens in Europe because there's so much more competition for wireless services, much more of a commodity than it is here. Here, lots of opportunity to price discriminate, to keep everybody in your grasp. Churn is, they're not losing very many customers, and they've got huge advantages. Another part of the problem is that Verizon and AT&T are steadily getting rid of any form of regulation of their activities. Most recently, they're claiming in really broad terms in front of the DC Circuit that they are speakers, that when they transmit bits from point A to point B, they're just like the New York Times. And so any regulation of the terms on which they transmit those bits is unconstitutional, right? It would have to be. If you're a speaker, the government can't tell you what to do. So they'll be making this argument in every forum from now on. They're starting with the DC Circuit. They'll keep going. They hope to reach the Supreme Court and convince them that really no oversight is appropriate of this particular commodity or utility. So, okay, I've sketched out this problem. We've got a real issue of people not having enough access. It's not fast enough. We're behind most of the other developed nations when it comes to availability of high-speed internet access, particularly fiber. Our costs are higher, our speeds are slower, we're leaving 1/3 of Americans out. What should we do? Okay, I have some answers. One thing we could do is make it easy for cities to do this for themselves. Seattle has announced an initiative like this. Same thing happened in Lafayette, Louisiana, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Bunch of places where Republican, Democrat mayors, doesn't matter what your party is, have decided that it's so important for economic growth and the flourishing of their city that they're going to make sure there's a competitive wholesale fiber ring in their city. They float a municipal bond, they build it, it pays itself back in lowered government costs over time. That's one step we could take. Make it easier for states to do it. For cities to do this on its own. Google's network that it's building right now in Kansas City is a very interesting, disruptive element here. Truly a faster network. A private company's behind it. We shouldn't have to wait for Google around the country. Here's the problem. In 19 states, it's either impossible or very difficult for a city to do this because the incumbents have persuaded the states that they should outlaw municipal broadband networks. You know what's interesting? Exactly the same thing happened in electricity. When small cities wanted to do this for themselves, the electrical companies said, oh, no, that's, they almost said it's Bolshevik, what a terrible socialist thing to do. And it took a lot of effort, again, on FDR's part to make it possible for municipalities to do. We should reverse these state laws. We should preempt them. We should get political action going in every city where the mayor is interested in doing this. This is not a left-right issue. It's bipartisan, just as it was for electricity and frankly, for lots of other fights in the beginning of the 20th century. Another thing we should do is condition access to rights-of-way in any place in the country on a provider's agreement to build an open network that allows lots of retail providers to connect. Remember back to Seoul, my story of how cheap it was in your apartment in Seoul to get that connection? That's because the mayor of Seoul built fiber in the subways around the city. Fiber is everywhere. That's a wholesale facility, and any retail provider can connect to it. We should require that every time we build a fiber connection in the United States, it has this kind of character, and that it's open. So we don't allow AT&T, Comcast, and Verizon to be the gatekeepers here, the private regulators. We should make it very easy for people wanting to build fiber networks to get access to capital. Right now, it's tricky. It would be a good idea to have an infrastructure bank to which you could apply to get the upfront capital that you need to build these really very expensive facilities. We did it for electricity. We should do it again for high-speed internet access. We should remove the built-in conflict of interest that now exists for people selling you internet access. Because Comcast is deeply vertically integrated into NBCU, it owns NBCU at this point, it has such an interest in preferring its partners' content to the internet. It's demonstrating this in all kinds of ways, not subjecting Xfinity video to the data caps that are present for the internet use on the same Comcast pipe. It's also doing it by constantly making it very expensive for anybody to enter to compete. Google, get this, wants to build in Kansas City. They need access to local sports in order to sell their network in Kansas City. Even though it's broadband, people also want programming. By controlling programming, Time Warner, who owns the local sports facility in Kansas City, can make it difficult for Google to get subscribers. And this can be replicated all across the country. Little guys, like municipal providers, will pay 3 to 4 times what a Comcast or a Time Warner will pay for the same programming. Because if you are big, if you operate at scale, you get much lower costs for programming than if you're a little guy. That's a huge problem. So the solution to this is to separate content from conduit. To say you're either a transport provider or you're selling programming, but you can't be both because the conflict of interest is so great. It gets in the way of innovation, of economic growth, of cultural thriving. But the most important thing we have to do is to get this on the radar screen. This issue, like global warming was a few years ago, like banking was a few years ago, is just not something the public knows about. We have such a job to do to tell this story very simply. There are lots of people around the country who are mad as hell about this. I had an article on Wired the other week that suddenly rose to #1 on Reddit. I've never seen something like that happen to something I wrote. That's amazing. And that's because there's so many people who care about this issue and are looking for places to act, things they could do. What we should be doing is electing to office people who take this as one of their top priorities. That's how Australia moved towards having a fiber to the home network. They actually elected a government who took that as its priority to provide fiber to everyone. We should be doing that in every congressional district in the United States, making it very easy for people to get involved, sign up, ask tough questions at debates, make sure that this is part of the national dialogue. We did this all for electricity. It took a lot of work. There were huge embedded interests who wanted the status quo to take place. As a country, we haven't changed our character so dramatically that we can't take on big issues like this one. Here's something that's an input into absolutely everything we do. For people who are in their 20s, this is like breathing air to have internet access. They can't imagine life without it. And they're the generation that's going to be coming into power. And for them, my generation needs to work harder on this particular issue. That inset picture is a picture of Kansas City, where Google is rolling out its fiber network, and neighborhoods are leaping up saying, we want to be first, come here, come here. You know, they can't wait because Google is selling fiber at a reasonable cost. It's about $70 a month. It should be cheaper. We should be able, each one of us, to have a connection in this country for about $30 to $40 a month. It's possible. Other countries are doing it. And so when you go home and you turn on the electric light, that lovely moment of just taking electricity for granted, remember that it took a political battle to get where we are. And think about Sandy. Think about how awful it was when you didn't have electricity or the ability to communicate, and how cut off and isolated and really afraid we all felt when that happened. There are many sections of the country where you just can't get online, or it's very frustrating or very expensive. And for the country as a whole, we're falling behind. We're becoming the Pottersville of internet access. It's really something. It's a sad state of affairs, and we shouldn't let this happen. We're the country that invented the internet. We're the country whose first generation internet applications stormed the world. But for the second generation, it's not so clear that we're going to be in the lead. And we have to somehow retain that pride and advantage. So get involved. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.